Hello, everybody. So good to be with you again here as we start session number 4. I can't believe we're at number 4 already, and we're thrilled. It's nice to have Meg Mulder again. I almost butchered that, didn't I?
No, it doesn't matter.
Nice to have Meg back with us.
Yes, it's nice to be back
for session 4. And before we get going, I'm just going to leave you with the same invitations that we sort of started with each week. Whether you are watching with us live tonight or whether you're going to be sort of following along, you can always follow up on all of our sessions by heading to the landing page that we've created for the course. There's always going to be, we're going to be continuing to add resources, even as the course finishes up tonight. We'll be in the coming days, just making sure that we get you all the tools and resources that we can. So make sure you check that out. And if you are watching with us live tonight, the invitation is extended again to throw your comments in the live chat. I'll be watching along as we go through the conversation. And if you have sort of pieces that you want us to come back to, or you have particular questions, we want to take time, especially at the end, to make sure we pull you into the conversation. We'll do our best. Who knows? Who knows if we'll have anything to offer you? Sometimes the questions are better than the content. That's what I've learned. All right. Well, so tonight we are going to lean into a conversation about what it means to practice spiritual formation as parents. Mm-hmm. And Meg and I have had a number of conversations about this, just getting ready and thinking about, this is a pretty big challenge. For those of us who are watching, many of us we've been participating in the Christian tradition, and we maybe are wanting our children to sort of inherit some of the best that the tradition has to offer. But maybe maybe that's a bit of a touchy thing for us. Maybe there's some complexity around the practice of how do I hand off this thing that I've received. And this led to, in some of our conversation, and also in some of my observation around the city, seeing more and more practitioners and therapists offering care to those who have experienced religious trauma. Mm-hmm. And so that's actually where we're going to start tonight, is try to have a conversation about what does it mean to practice spiritual formation. Hopefully it'll be practical at some point this evening. We will try to give you some tools. Yep. But maybe we need to start with a little bit of an exploration of, wait, maybe I've experienced the tradition in a way that is impacting my parenting. Yeah. And I maybe should try to be curious about that. So I think that's where we're going to jump in.
I think so. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, why don't you go ahead?
Okay. I think, connecting back to even what we were talking about last week, so much of parenting, I think actually maybe all 4 weeks, so much of parenting is doing our own work. And when we're talking about wanting to, foster spiritual formation in our children, and how do we do that as parents? Yeah, we have to start with ourselves. This word religious trauma, spiritual trauma, it's kind of a buzzword lately. It's become maybe more well-known, more and more research is being done on it. More practitioners are starting to understand the importance of it. But I still think there's a lot of people that maybe don't fully understand what it is. Because trauma can be a really big word, right? And for a lot of us who grew up in faith communities, whether they were Christian tradition or otherwise, some of us can point to some actual things that we could easily identify as traumatic in our lives. And others of us might just be like, there's things I'm still uncomfortable with or I know weren't healthy, but I can't really put my finger on why. And so what does that mean? And does that constitute trauma? Just for purposes of our discussion, I just want to define a couple terms just so that we're all on the same page. So when we talk about spirituality and religion, they're connected, obviously, but not necessarily the same thing. So you can kind of think of spirituality as more the subjective experience of something sacred versus religion as a system of beliefs and practices that are connected to that experience. For the most part, the term becomes religious trauma because a lot of the trauma that people experience is around the system that's been built. But spiritual trauma can also be a reality for some people where the experience itself has had negative impacts. But when we talk about trauma, I think there's different ways that the word is used, and there's different ways it can be defined. So for the purposes of our discussion, I love a definition that Gabor Mate uses. And he talks about trauma being, the Greek word is from the word wound. And so trauma isn't what happens to us, it's what happens inside of us as a result of an event or an experience. Yeah. So it's the wound that we carry as the result of something we've experienced, not the event itself. And this actually gives us hope, I think, because it can empower us to change and heal that wound, versus if we only think of it as the event, like we can't go back and change the past, right? So this can be an empowering way to look at trauma and to understand it. I think it's also important to note that trauma is kind of like so many things in life on a continuum, right? Gabor Mate again talks about little t trauma versus capital T trauma. And capital T trauma is like those big events, things like poverty, abuse, severe neglect, maybe a really bad car accident, or, natural disaster, war, those kinds of things. Vulnerable people experience really awful things that they shouldn't ever experience. But then he also talks about this idea of small t trauma, and it's this idea of like little things that we experience throughout our life that wound us. Maybe not hugely, but whether it's bullying, or whether it's a particularly critical parent, or, a message that we receive in our faith community that constantly cuts down our self-worth, or any of those kinds of things. And so, part of figuring out, do I carry some religious trauma, is identifying kind of where on the continuum it falls, or if there's more than one thing that fits in there. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. So when we're talking about religious trauma or spiritual trauma, we're really just talking about what are our psychological, physical, emotional responses to an experience that we had in a religious context that felt overwhelming, that felt disruptive, or had lasting adverse effects on us. And so when you define it that way, there's a lot of things that could fit into that, right? I think it's also important to note that the other piece of identifying trauma as the wound we carry versus the event itself is that we all respond to events differently, right? You can have two people experience the exact same catastrophic event, and one person carries around PTSD and the other person doesn't. And that's not an indication of one person being stronger or better than the other. It's just the way that it's impacted us. And so I think that's important to note too. I think a lot of us might feel hesitant to say, oh yes, I've experienced religious trauma, because it's easy to compare ourselves to other people too, right? But trauma isn't really a comparable thing. If you're wounded and it impacted you, it's something that you should probably deal with. And it's not about whether it was as bad as somebody else's experience. And so those are kind of all of the thoughts and ideas that come into my head when I'm thinking and talking about, and hopefully can inform our conversation around religious trauma and whether that fits.
Right, and the context is, as I think you said right off the top, this is where we have to start in our relationship to being the people who are the primary sort of actors in forming our children.
Yes.
Sort of coming to grips with our own experience. Yeah. Which I think is a really great place to start.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you mind if we just pause for a second?
Not
I think
at all.
we're getting a little feedback.
Oh, okay. Do I have to fix this?
Just pull that off your face slightly, and
is that better?
I'll see.
Excellent.
I think we're going to be good.
Okay, perfect.
Awesome.
Thank you for bearing with our technical difficulties. And so the other thing about trauma, I think, is that at its very essence, it's basically a loss of connection with ourselves, our families, our relationships, our communities. So if you can think of trauma as a loss of connection, then healing trauma becomes, how do I find connection again? And in the context of parenting, that fits on a number of levels, I think, and especially with parenting for spiritual formation. Okay, and so then, as you were just saying, to kind of build on what you were saying about connections to parenting around spiritual formation and whether religious trauma is real for us or not, if we don't deal with our own woundedness around our religious and spiritual upbringing and experiences, then the likelihood of us passing that on to our children or not passing anything concrete on, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, and the dangers of that, becomes much higher, right? And so similar to what we chatted about with, helping understand and helping our children understand their own sexuality, that's the same kind of role we have as parents with their spirituality. And, that idea of a wound, I think, also works really well. The image works really well if you're thinking of ourselves as parents. Like, if we don't tend to a wound, it's either going to stay open and raw, and it's going to be really easily painful and activated, or it's going to get us scarred over, and then we don't have as much flexibility, or there's like, a wall up or something. And even the smallest little scratches can become infected if we don't tend to them. And so it's really important to recognize where we need to heal in this area as parents. Yeah.
It's really important to realize where we need to heal. Yeah. We should just stop.
Okay, done. That's it. Thanks for coming.
Oh, my goodness. I mean, this is profound for me. And I guess I'm listening to you and I'm thinking about just wanting to expand my imagination as I think about my relationship with my children, who I want to spiritually form, to be aware that the things that I might think are harmful might not be. Like, there's an invitation to a broader definition of trauma, first of all, and then to just choose to try to be aware over time to the little things. An idea that I think is harmless, but for them it's not.
Right.
And choosing to form in an ongoing, with the goal of healing.
Yes.
Anyways, we're 5 minutes in and I don't know what to do with. That's great. Okay.
No, and I think that connects to some of what you're going to talk about later too, right? Maybe. Yeah, I think it does. We'll see. We'll figure it out as we go. And so I think I wanted to just sort of walk us through, won't spend too much time on this, but walk us through a little bit of like, what are some potential impacts of religious trauma or adverse religious experiences, and looking at seeing if you can identify any of them. And then I have a series of questions that we can ask ourselves to see if, hey, do I carry some of these wounds around? And then we can jump into a little bit more of the practical stuff.
Great.
Okay. So essentially, as with any kind of trauma, religious trauma or adverse religious experiences can affect us cognitively, developmentally, emotionally, relationally, socially, all across the board. So what does that look like? Yeah. Cognitively, it can affect our ability to make decisions or to think critically. I think many of us have experienced, or we see it happening in certain faith communities in the world today, where, really binary thinking, black and white, not being willing to engage in critical thinking around issues of faith or what is truth. Those kinds of things, often it's fear-based. And there's just sort of an inability to really authentically engage with some of those bigger questions because, as our critical thinking skills are kind of put on hold. And that can lead to an inability to tolerate diverse ideas. It can lead to clinging to biases, oversimplifying things. And those aren't necessarily bad in certain situations, but the blinders aren't always going to be useful either. Right. Yeah. Other cognitive impacts can be not really understanding who we are as people. We may have a lack of awareness of like what we want or need, or even who we are apart from a religious group. Like if I'm not a Christian, or if I'm not a member of this church or this faith community, who am I? Especially for some of us who have grown up in it from the very beginning, and that was like our whole community. That can be an impact, especially if we choose to leave and other people don't understand that, or we just our faith shifts and it's no longer understandable or acceptable to other people in the community that we were a part of. It can lead to an external locus of control, which is just a fancy way of saying depending on a lot of other people to make decisions for us because, we don't trust our own instincts because we've sort of been told not to, or at least that's the message we've heard, whether or not that was actually told to us. Or, there's this sort of idea of, if I can explain what I mean by that a little bit, of like, well, you have to figure out what God wants you to do. And then it becomes less about what are my instincts and can I trust what I want, and more about trying to seek an external. And then if I can't figure that out, then I'm going to spiritual authorities or whatever. Again, not necessarily a bad thing, but if that's constantly shutting down our ability to trust our own instincts, that can lead to some, pretty big issues later on in life. And can really come up in our parenting if we still don't trust our instincts, right? It can lead to cynicism. I think when this idea of religious trauma first started coming up, which was, I think the first time you really notice it kind of coming up in like the research or even in just like professional circles was probably like 60s, but really not research being done until around the 80s. And a lot of it was just sort of this like, religious communities are bad. They cause trauma, and the only like atheism or extricating yourself from it is that's how you deal with it. But we realize it's a lot more nuanced than that now. And in fact, for most people, it's about redefining, not about completely. For some people, it is completely leaving it behind, and that's okay too. Right. But it's, that cynicism of I'm not willing to explore another option. That can be a negative impact. I kind of mentioned this already, but just not being able to trust ourselves, right? We don't trust our judgments, our perceptions, things like that. Developmentally, it can lead to insecure attachment styles, and without getting all the way into attachment theory and that kind of thing, just more that idea of we are either inclined to really people please and do whatever we need to do to fit in with the group, or we do the opposite. As a way of being like, I'm the only one who can take care of myself because this isn't meeting my needs, as opposed to more of a mutual relationship. Those kinds of things can pop up. There can be developmental trauma or delayed cognitive, emotional, social skills, depending on, how controlling the religious environment is and that kind of thing too. Emotions can be emotional suppression. Sometimes people in religious communities are taught that certain emotions are bad or sinful, like anger or you can feel it but you can't express it, or there can be an inability to fully feel and process our emotions because we're not taught how to do that, or we're taught the opposite. Might have difficulty communicating our emotions, and we might not trust our own feelings. Again, we'll just invalidate them. Fear and anxiety. In my own clinical practice, I do see a lot of this, of fear of death, fear of eternal damnation, whether that's, hell or people you love going there, worried about saving other people, feeling responsible for other people's salvation, difficulty feeling safe in spiritual settings, fearing evil. Some people fearing demonic forces or being tempted, making bad decisions. Like that can be a pretty big negative side effect of religious trauma. And then excessive shame and guilt or low self-worth. Emotionally, we either think we're inherently evil or born sinful, or I'm a bad person, or we have an inflated sense of personal responsibility around certain things, like somebody else's salvation, for example. I work with a lot of people who grew up in the Mormon community, and there's a lot of that kind of thing of like this feeling of like, yeah, this is your responsibility and this is your whole goal in life, and that comes with a lot of weight. Yeah. Harsh self-criticism, those kinds of things. Also, religious trauma can affect us functionally or behaviorally. If we're not able to cope or we don't know how to process it, can lead to addictive behaviors like any kind of trauma, substance use, controlling tendencies, numbing behaviors, perfectionism. There's lots of those kinds of coping skills that work in the moment but long-term are not healthy. Sometimes people find themselves really ruminating about past mistakes or errors. possible sins, or using religious rituals to prevent bad things from happening. So like excessive praying or, lighting candles, whatever particular thing, praying the rosary, whatever. There's all different faith things of different rituals that people use as a means of trying to control the situation in a negative way.
Can I just ask quickly? And it seems to me that forms of, like, for lack of better language, addictive religious behaviors, they can appear benign.
They can.
Right? And they can actually be celebrated.
Absolutely.
That person is very dedicated or they are very devout. That's an interesting thing to think about or to pay attention to in our own practice of spiritual discipline.
Yes.
Right? Like to pay attention to the thing that can actually be benign if I'm not... because I'm in a social environment, a religious environment that sort of reifies that as, isn't that the goal? Isn't the goal to always be praying? Isn't the goal to...
always be helping other people.
Right. I think that's just a helpful lens.
I agree. Thank you for sharing that and mentioning it, because I'm thinking about that in the context of parenting as well.
Yes.
You can commit so much of your time and energy to your religious community that your family suffers, or... you're setting this example for your children of like extreme self-denial. That isn't healthy either, right?
Right.
I don't know if that's where you were going with that, but that's where my brain went.
Paying attention to that.
Yeah, being aware of that. Because another piece of that functional behavioral thing that we can see with religious trauma is that self-deprivation or neglect of where everybody else comes before we do. And let's be honest, as parents, that's sometimes just a natural go-to anyways. And sometimes that is what has to happen. Sometimes we really do have to just put our own needs aside to take care of the little people or other people in our world, and that's okay once in a while. But when it becomes this consistent, pervasive pattern, and we're constantly denying our own wants and needs, that's when you can see some of those negative effects coming up. Yeah. Socially, sometimes you'll see poor personal boundaries, the fancy words of like enmeshment or codependency, where you're really dependent on other people, or you can't separate yourself from the group. Authority issues, we kind of talked about that already, whether you're like being excessively pleasing or submitting versus, no, I want nothing to do with that. Being rebellious or defiant. And then social anxiety often comes up. Sometimes as a result of like, it feels performative. Our relationships become performative because we need to be accepted within the group. And again, this isn't necessarily, actually I shouldn't say again because I don't think I've mentioned this, but I do want to clarify, like, none of this is assuming that religion in itself is bad or that it's always the cause. This is part of identifying religious trauma, is how did my religious experience or my experiences within religious or spiritual communities impact me. So again, it's not about vilifying this, that, or the other thing. It's just about identifying certain ways of like patterns or things like that. I don't know if this is helpful, but I'm going to throw it out there anyways. As a personal example from my own life, I remember as an adult telling my mom that I used to pray every single night that I wouldn't go to hell, because I was worried if I didn't pray every single night or I forgot and Jesus came back, I might not go to heaven. And my mom was so baffled. She's like, I never taught you that. Like, we never. And I said, no, but that's something that I internalized from the way things were presented to me. And so that was a very real anxiety in my childhood that impacted me. And it's not anybody's fault, really. It just was.
It's something that you picked up, and I think that's why your expanded, more general, or just you talking us through definition of like trauma. Think of the wound and the fact that, especially as parents, trying to pay attention to the kinds of things that seem to inform our children's spiritual life or their faith.
Yeah.
Because it might be things that we didn't teach them.
Yeah.
Might be things that they either inherit or that they sort of pick up, and who knows where. And to just, as much as we can, if we see those things, we can sort of try to be present to them and be I love the language you use, that healing is sort of the practice of reconnecting. So
Yeah.
whatever part of that idea or that practice or that anxiety, that we could be a connecting presence
Yes.
for whatever is, so if there's a gap
Yeah.
in their idea of God and their idea of, if they're accepted, their cosmology about where we go when we die, all these things, could we be a connective presence?
Yes.
I might come back to that at some point tonight. I think that's, if we're not parenting and spiritually forming our children to inform that kind of connective tissue, both for our relationship with them, but if the relationship with the divine, whoever and whatever God might be, God's goodness, if it's not rooted in connection,
what are we doing?
Yeah, let's rethink it.
Yeah.
Right? Let's re-examine whatever that idea is. Anyway.
Absolutely.
So good.
Yeah. All right. Lastly, I just want to really quickly touch on how religious trauma can affect us physically. It can, encourage us to disconnect from our body's needs and sensations. I think we chatted a little bit about this last week in kind of purity culture stuff that we had kind of touched on in terms of sexual development, where we're just sort of told to, a lot of us were taught to just sort of shut down those innate desires and like, nope, you're not allowed to want that until you magically have a ring on your finger. And, and so then we end up doing that on more than one level, consciously or not, where we just don't stop paying attention to our body's wants and needs. And so that can be one of the things. Again, this is not going to be true for everybody. These are just possibilities. Emphasis on like sexual conformity, denying what you might be attracted to, or even an inability to enjoy sex because it feels like you're not allowed to. Those are all things that can come up too.
I mean, again, the goal, at least I think, like when we've talked about this, again, I'm somebody who I don't think I have a lot of this kind of trauma in my life. But I'm increasingly aware that both on the therapeutic landscape, but then in faith communities that are trying to be critically engaged and honest, obviously we want to be a community like that, there is an increased awareness that these, as you've said, some of these pieces could be rooted in bigger events in our lives, but there's also, specifically when we come to parenting, like there's ways in which my experience of faith, my experience of being spiritually formed is going to start impacting my capacity to translate or to shape my children. And that goes for all spheres of life. But that's why I think it's interesting or helpful to have these sort of breakdowns. I mean, it can be honest, as we met and like we had a couple of conversations about some of the scope of this conversation, and for me to give me examples of what traumas can look like in a person's life. And some of it's in those lists. I just had never thought, oh, right, that's totally, it can be a byproduct. Yeah. So can we offer this as an attempt to give, well, I'm sitting here writing notes for myself, but give each of us like a set of glasses or lenses through which to re-examine your own spiritual formation as a first step towards the active engagement. Because, I mean, have you said it already? You are already shaping your children spiritually.
Yeah,
if you have children, you are forming them spiritually. So just paying attention. So
yes,
and I think you actually have. Like, are you doing the? Is it a questionnaire?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I don't know if that's what you were going to go into.
It's called a religious trauma inventory.
Oh boy. Okay.
And I think that all of the questions are on the slides. I'm not going to read all of them, but they're also in the handout that will be downloaded.
That will be downloadable.
Yeah. So you can go back to them. I'm just going to highlight a few of them as just interest of time. And one of the things that I will do with clients in my own practice is really invite them as we walk through these, and this is different because we're obviously not in a clinical setting and I'm not face-to-face with those of you who are watching, and so we can't have a conversation about these things, but I start with inviting and I'm going to invite you to do the same. As I read some of these, just notice if anything comes up in your body. I know that's one of those weird things that therapists like to say, but that idea of like our bodies tell us things about how we're feeling. And so if I read something and it makes your stomach clench or your heart pound a little faster, you notice you're kind of sweating or feeling uncomfortable, maybe there's a little bit of trauma there. Or maybe there's something there that's worth exploring to see if it is impacting, your ability to parent your children spiritually the way that you want to. Yeah.
You're asking me to pay attention.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Oh boy.
All right. I won't ask you to share.
No, I
mean, you can, but you don't have to. Okay, so again, I think there's 37 questions here. I'm not going to read them all. I'll just pick a few of them. So these are different statements that you can identify as either reflecting current or past mindsets within a religious context for you. So number 1, I'm in danger of being excluded from the afterlife. Does that bring anything up for you? It's my responsibility to tell non-believers the truth. I might commit evil or sin without realizing it. My salvation depends on me doing things right. I'm a naturally bad or sinful person. There's something wrong with me spiritually. My well-being isn't a priority to God. Oh, this is a good one. My own stuff coming up here. My value comes from serving God and other people. My body's natural instincts are wrong. I shouldn't trust my emotions. I should always be joyful or grateful. I shouldn't have doubts about my faith. I should always confess my failures or my sins. I should never be resentful of other people. I should always forgive people who hurt me. That's just a little smattering. There's a few more.
Just a light dusting?
Just a light dusting. Nothing really intense there.
Huh.
I know I went through them quite quickly.
Yeah, no. I do want to just pause for a second. And we will, as Meg said, this is it's an evaluative tool. You've sourced, I saw it in your notes, the source that it comes from. So this is part of a sort of a clinical approach to trying to help people approach these kinds of things. What I found myself thinking is, I think probably to a person, any parent listening to this, if you are listening to these questions, if you don't have an immediate response, you're listening to it saying, I wouldn't ever want my children to say yes to any of these things, or a version of that question that feels heavy or laden with maybe the wrong kinds of meaning. And to me, that's a really interesting thing to note, that I think we have this desire as parents to want to spiritually form our kids.
Yes.
To want to give them the best of what we've encountered in God's goodness or in the community that sort of has represented that for us. And that sort of, to me, that's a really interesting thing to be aware of, that I would not want intentionally to cause these kinds of things to pop up through my parenting. I wouldn't want it to pop up in my kids. And then I'm a member of this community, and I don't want it to pop up in any of the beautiful kids that are around this place. And I don't know, that to me also, makes there's like an underlying imperative to pay attention to my own experience. Because some of the ones that you read at the beginning there, I got to do things right. There was one right before that was sort of like, I got to make sure, or maybe it was the story you told. Like, I have some layers to the, like, I got to make sure I stay on top of my accounts with God, because there's like an underlying uncertainty to how things might play out. Should I be hit by a bus, or should Jesus? I grew up in a tradition that there was a lot of teaching about Jesus' return. So a lot of eschatological it's supposed to be eschatological hope, just so we're clear.
Okay.
Not eschatological panic, but I had a lot of the panic side. So, yeah, just paying attention to that. And, I as we all do, we probably have some work to do on being able to name. Maybe we can name clearly what it is, and we already know how we're going to steer away from that as we choose to sort of form our kids. But I guess the first step is to know what parts am I avoiding, or what parts of my tradition am I just not willing to talk about, or which ones am I replicating without even thinking about like a fear-based approach to who God might be.
And I think, like what you're saying, like this is not an exhaustive list by any means, and there's lots of other things that might, and some of these things might not have any bearing for you at all, and some of them you might not even disagree with, and that's fine. But it's knowing, right? Oh, yeah. What I wanted to say was, I don't want my kids to have this, but I do think we have to also recognize that they probably are going to internalize things in a way that we never intended or wanted, and like my example, but just they're going to hear it from somewhere, so it's not even about like really trying to prevent that from happening, but being open about, our own experiences and talking through those things, which we'll come back to later. Yeah. Great. Awesome. Okay. I wanted to really briefly also just touch on some kinds of questions that we can ask ourselves about what we really do believe in terms of our religious framework, our faith, that idea of deconstructing, reconstructing, tearing down the Lego house, building up again, as Jeremy talked about. I don't remember when that was, but I love that sermon. And how do we do some of that process work as we try to figure out how to parent our kids as little spiritual beings? So, or big ones, as the case may be, as they get older really fast. And so this isn't about accepting or rejecting a belief system as a whole. It's about analyzing individual parts. I think we sort of mentioned that already, but it's like, if I'm remembering correctly, and I'm really sorry if I'm butchering this, but I seem to remember Jeremy talking about like, you take everything apart, you pick up a piece of Lego and be like, does this still fit for me? Or do I put it aside? Does it go back in my new building of what I'm building, or doesn't it? I don't know. Sorry, Jeremy, if I got that wrong. Still fits though, I think. Yes, and it's not about finding the right answers, which is maybe something we can touch on a little bit more too, but it's about creating space to help us decide what we believe and giving ourselves permission to be curious and explore. Yeah, which can be a hard thing to do when we're talking about things like eternity and things that we've grown up with. So, yeah. So, on that, again, I don't want to belabor the point, but in terms of, these are just some questions you can ask about some of the big elements of religion. Again, I'm just going to pick a couple of them. There's a larger list in the handout that you can download after. But just some of the questions that you can start asking yourself and your children. One of the things that I'll mention a little bit more about later too is that we can learn some of this stuff along with our kids, and we can explore it together. We don't have to have all the answers before we start working on spiritually forming them. But I'll come back to that. So here's just, again, a bit of a guideline to help you kind of figure out, what do I really believe and what do I want to pass on to my children, or what do I want to invite my child or my children to explore for themselves and come to their own understanding of. So things like, is God good? How can we determine this? Are humans born fundamentally good or evil? Can they change? Here's a good one. Everyone can get the answer to this one. Why is there pain and evil and suffering in the world? Right. Everyone can find the answer to that. A big one, did God create the world intending for evil to happen? Or did he know and do it anyways, right? And again, this isn't about finding the right answer. Like, I'm not sure it's helpful. Be careful how I say this, but I'm not sure it's helpful to try and go proof texting in the Bible or trying to find answers to these questions that this is what it says or this is what the answer is. It's more about what makes sense for me and my understanding of God. And that fits.
Right, and I would just add, I think you can do this in consort with the tradition itself.
Oh, absolutely.
Right, like, because these questions, they're big, and the tradition has sort of like wrestled with them for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah, this is not something you have to do like on your own or, this should be done, in community. Yeah. Another big kind of category is like design. So our beliefs about the origin of the world, meaning of life, purpose of human existence, those kinds of things. So just little questions. Yeah. Mm-hmm. How did the universe come into being? How important are humans in the grand scheme of things? Are human actions predetermined, or do we have agency over our choices? Were humans designed to fall into two distinct genders and or only be heterosexual? Like, you can get some big questions going on here in terms of like what fits for you. What kind of conversations do you want to be having, again, in community, to figure out how we want to pass on some of this stuff to our children or help them think about their own faith, right? Divinity. How can humans learn about God? What is God's character like? Is there only one God? Can God's character evolve? It's kind of my personality now. I think years ago, this would have felt very unsafe. Kind of like walking across like a glass floor that could shatter at any minute because like my foundation is cracking and I don't really know like all these things, like even thinking that I can ask these questions and come up with a different answer than my tradition told me. But now I feel like it just provides so much freedom to explore and figure it out and create a faith that makes sense to me.
Which is beautiful. It's lovely that you'd share that with us. I think what's compelling in this moment is how the questions you're asking, I think, are the kinds of questions that inevitably, if we don't ask them ourselves about our own theological perspectives or our own spiritual practices, like our children will inspire them by asking themselves. And again, it comes back to the practice of parenting is so much the practice of self-awareness. So that I know enough about myself to know that when my kids do something that I'm troubled by, or they ask me a theological question that I don't have an answer to, I know well enough to know why I'm uncomfortable.
Yes.
It could be because I have the same question, or it could be because I've thought deep and hard about this, and maybe I've learned some really difficult lessons about that. And I want to spare you some grief, but we can't begin to be a healthy, whole, hopefully gracious parent if we don't start to just be curious about those things. So I'm grateful that you have a list for all of us as participants to sort of, find our way through it, to think about what is it that I want to actively hand over.
Right. And I can't take credit for this list, by the way.
No, of course not.
But it's,
Of course not.
It's linked in the thing so you can find it.
You've done the work, though. You've uncovered it for us. This is great.
Asking questions about the afterlife. Is there eternity? Do decisions we make now have eternal consequences? Is there heaven? Is there hell? What happens to our souls? Is there reincarnation? All of those kinds of questions. Questions about dominion. Does God really have dominion over everything? Do humans have authority over earth and animals? Are there God-ordained hierarchies between people? Some of those kinds of small questions again. And then the sacred, and specifically about like objects, practices, traditions that we might want to pass along to our children that are connected to our faith and spirituality. So asking questions like, why do we follow certain religious practices or traditions, which I think is something that Commons has, dug into a little bit. Is Scripture sacred? Is it never wrong? Who has the right to interpret Scripture? And how does that fit into the way we parent our kids around this as well? So, yeah.
That's great.
Awesome. I'm mindful of the time. So, couple practical things. And again, there's a longer list that you can access afterwards. But in terms of how do we help parent for spiritual formation? Like, what are some practical things that we can do? We already talked about doing our own work, knowing what we want to pass on, what we don't want to pass on. I think it's really important in any area of parenting to practice self-compassion for ourselves, to foster self-trust in ourselves and in our children. One of the books that I was researching for this talk, I really liked how she put it. She talked about because of who God is, God can be trusted, and so we can parent our kids around spirituality with this sort of trust paradigm of like trust base that God will reveal himself to our children if we give them permission and help them find ways to give themselves permission to discover who he really is. And that can be really freeing, I think.
Yeah, I think I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes. That's great.
You mentioned this already too, being honest with kids about what we don't know and being okay with not having the answers. Learning with our kids, saying, hey, I'm not sure. Why don't we talk about this? Why don't we explore it a little bit? Learning from our kids. I mean, there's a reason I think Jesus talks about childlike faith. And I don't know if there's any parent that hasn't been like blown away by just something beautiful that our children teach us about God or spirituality or sacredness or whatever. Validating our children's spiritual experiences and cultivating the agency in their own spirituality. So that idea of like not telling them what to believe necessarily, but giving them permission to figure that out for themselves with our guidance, alongside us, in community. Like, again, this is not do this on your own, but allowing our kids to recognize that they don't just have to blindly swallow whatever we tell them or their faith community tells them, if that fits.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a strong believer in that. And maybe, I think just before we are done tonight, I want to just talk through, again, there's a sort of a developmental scale I think we can use.
Absolutely.
Quite intentionally.
Yeah.
And this is certainly, I think, just as an example, one of the ways that we would do exactly what you just said when our children are young is to be comfortable with like the big questions that they might ask that we can't possibly answer for them. So to just to give it our best try, and I think it's one of the things I plan on saying. I think sometimes it's okay for us to sound more certain than we know we are.
Yeah.
Because that's a feature of developmental assertion.
Very good point, yeah.
Like, effectively, a child's brain needs some of that in order to just move forward to the next stage. And so people say, well, that's being dishonest, or that's not being true to what I think is real. It's like, well, are you going to try to explain the great complexity of your own personal theodicy, how you explain the existence of evil to your 4-year-old when they see or encounter something profoundly tragic or dark? I think to a person we would say, no, I probably wouldn't.
No.
And I'll just put my theological cards on the table. I'm also not going to say, well, that's what God wants to be true in the world. I think that's toxic and harmful theology. So there's a really interesting sort of tension, I think, sometimes for us as parents to sort of stay in step with our children developmentally, and then to move towards the kinds of active, how do I, like for instance, when my 4-year-old asks me a question I don't have an answer to, I can respond very differently than when my 17-year-old asks me a question. Because there's something about a 17-year-old's question where I can do exactly what you just said. I can give a gift to them, and actually try to stoke their agency. Like, you're thinking critically about this. That's actually going to keep you safe and hold you as a spiritual practice.
Yes.
anyway.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just riffing on it a bit. But
No,
that's good.
I really love that because, my bias of having children who are moving into older ages is clearly showing. But coming back to I think that developmental piece is absolutely important. We talked about it even with helping our children develop their sexuality. It's the same thing. Like, we have to be aware of their developmental capabilities. One thing I think that maybe some religious communities haven't done a great job of introducing children to pretty violent, intense things at ages that are developmentally, they're not really capable of processing what that means. But that's a whole nother thing. But I think maybe instead of thinking it as like lying, it's more like we're providing a framework that they can use at this point in their life. That framework can change, it can grow, it can become more nuanced, but we're giving them something to hang on to. One of the things in here is offering children placeholders to express their spirituality, because they need that. They need those developmental boundaries to be able to take that next step, like you said, and learn and grow. Yeah, that's it. That's all I got. You're up.
That's it.
That's it.
Okay. Well, that's it. That's all I've got.
That's it. That's all I got. I'm done. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, you've just gotten really practical. And I actually want to sort of jump in as we've talked a little bit about this. I want to sort of, before we're done tonight, I want to actually move. I had sort of thought about talking a little bit about the context in which we do some of this work of spiritual formation, talk a little bit about Canadian culture and society that's increasingly irreligious. And I think I'm going to actually just push that to the back burner. Mostly because I think many of us are probably aware of the ways in which Canadian society has changed more broadly, and where the practices of the Christian tradition are marginalized pretty significantly from what they were about, certainly, I was going to say 100 years ago, 50 years ago. And what's interesting is that we live in a part of the country that still has a pretty significant about 48% of Albertans say that they adhere to the Christian tradition. Alberta has a pretty high percentage of people who would be active or fervent participants, but 40% of Albertans in the 2021 census actually claimed no religious affiliation.
Okay.
And then we have about 11% of the Albertan population that's a religion other than Christianity. And so for me, this was a really interesting thing to think about living in the city of Calgary, doing the work of spiritual formation. I think there's this perspective for lots of Christian people in this part of the world. There's the assumption of like an underlying sort of Christian malaise or subculture.
Yeah.
And the truth is that at least more than half of the people that your children will go to school with, interact with on your street, are likely they're just not going to be religious people, or they'll be people from a different religious tradition, which means that we do the work of like forming our children in this really dynamic environment, one that's not sort of weighed down by sort of the Christian tradition or the history. Now, we are living in a time when the Christian tradition is sort of slowly being unentangled from the colonial project. We have to pay attention to that. These are some of the broad strokes I wanted to sort of say, hey, this is really important work, and to try to offer some version of our faith to our children. We're going to be doing that in a world that's going to keep changing and keep moving in some of these directions. And I think that actually just makes our participation in the process all the more important. We can offer our children a gift and do that dynamically sort of through their lives. And I think that's probably, I know it's even different for me now. My children are older and they're going to high school and they have friends from all over the world. I just love the challenge. I think it's a pretty interesting thing to think about. That said, I wanted to go over just some simple ways that we can start, some suggestions that they're just some that we could come up with for how can I actively start to engage the process of spiritual formation. And I offer these having not even tried all of them all that effectively? That's maybe the question I can come back to. I see that we've got a question here in the chat, so I'm going to come back to it right at the end. I want to suggest, and we've sort of already touched on this, it's come up when we do this evaluative work, thinking about our own experience. But I want to suggest that we choose to spiritually form our children for their good. Not so that they behave a certain way or that they don't go to hell or some other fear-based narrative, but that we choose to form them as Christians because we trust that Jesus' way is good for them and it's good for their neighbors and it's good for all creation. And that means that we should attempt to practice spiritual formation, I think, in line with our attempts as much as is possible to forming a secure attachment with our kids. I don't know if it's possible to actively form healthy, secure attachment with our kids while teaching them and forming them spiritually in ways that are harmful or make them insecure about themselves or make them insecure about God. And I actually think that if we were to teach our kids about the mystery of God, the story and the ethic of Jesus, so that they stay Christian all the while they are unsure of our love, or that they don't know how to connect with us or other people emotionally, or they are feeling like they are undeserving, if we quote unquote are successful in forming them, but they have all this baggage, I think actually we should be a little suspicious. And I'm pretty sure that those of us who are watching, we don't want to end up in a boat like that. No. And we want to do the work of sort of being critical. So let's just assume that we won't do it perfectly all the time, but that we can choose to do this work on purpose. And it seems to me that sort of goal of forming a secure attachment as much as is possible, that this is actually this is a divine model. Yeah. If you think of creation as the work of God in the cosmos, the work of God in time, if God's goal is to connect and to be securely connected with creation, it seems to me that I want to follow that as much as possible. Like, God doesn't want to save and renew all things by scaring us into being in the right place at the right time. Like, that's not a thing. No. At least I would contend theologically that maybe we should have a different imagination for God. So that said, I've got some practical things I'm going to offer, and then we'll come to a question. I think Chris has put one in the chat. Okay. I'm just going to go through these things because I think they're they're not self-explanatory, but I want to offer them. So I think one of the first things we can do to sort of practice spiritual formation, and this is one of the things we try to inspire in our community here at Commons, is prioritizing the redemptive story that we see in Scripture. To think of faith as the process of learning a story, and then starting to live in that story, and then finding the way to choose to share that story. To me, that's like the natural progression that we want to inspire in anybody who's part of our community. And why do I sort of, I've really come to believe this, that it's actually the story that, quote unquote, saves me. It's what teaches me who God is. It teaches me who I am by pointing to Jesus. It sets all human action and endeavor within the context of this redemptive arc that God is at work doing. And this is what it does is it sort of helped ground my understanding of my own tradition in a narrative that it's actually about the story being compelling and beautiful and worth telling in the world. There's a Nigerian storyteller, his name's Ben Okri, and he says that one way or another we're living in the stories placed in us early or along the way in our lives. Or we are living in the stories that we've planted, knowingly or unknowingly in ourselves. And he actually sort of argues that if we can change the story we live by, quite possibly we change the content of our lives. And to me, that's such a compelling version of what it means to be a Christian, to be a follower of the way of Jesus. Because if I'm compelled by the story, and I prioritize that in how I offer my faith to my children, I think I'm going to maybe offer them a more full and robust perspective. Absolutely. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Oh, like there's a whole therapeutic modality built on that exact assumption of that. If we can retell our stories and reauthor our stories, we can change our lives. So I love it.
Right, which seems to me that therapeutic model it's riddled with divine grace.
Absolutely.
That's beautiful. So how do we do this? We do it through exposure to the scripture. We've already talked a little bit about this, and you can learn more about our approach. Commons, we have it on our, we have a parenting page, sort of lets parents know some of how we practice these things at Commons. But we want to root our telling of the story of Jesus in age-appropriate ways, how it unfolds. And then sort of grow in our capacity to help children move from just the basic stories and move from just basic moralism to ultimately teaching them how to read Scripture and to be critically engaged, to be critical readers. So if you want to know more about Commons, I actually brought the book up here. Meg had it in her bag, which was super convenient. We have a 3-year sort of liturgy, telling God's story. It's the scholarship of Pete Enns that informs that. Happy to talk more about that, but for us, at least for me, prioritizing the story.
Yeah.
Faith is built on story, and it's the story that ultimately will renew and restore us.
Sorry if I can just jump in for a second.
Jump in for a second.
It just reminds me like how much Jesus taught through story, because he recognized that. And, you know, maybe he was modeling for us how we can do this work. And it's such a beautiful place to start, I think. And not only that, but we can identify with and place ourselves in story no matter where we're at in our lives developmentally. You can use story with a 2-year-old. You can use story with a 64-year-old. It's this thing that is universally accessible, I think.
Right, and this is why, in the way that we teach Scripture in our community, but then also in the resources that we provide. So we have some in our reading library to help you in how you understand Scripture, but then there are a number of resources that we'll try to include in sort of like a course bibliography for how you can think about some of the developmental changes that happen in the way that you might bring Scripture into family rhythms. I'll talk about that in just a second, actually. Okay, second thing I want to just mention, are you okay, or did you have something else?
That's all I got.
Is this idea that the calendar can help you in forming your children. And what I mean by this is that I think we don't realize that by leaning into the structure of how the church has historically observed each year, we can help shape our children's lives. And so one of the things that you can do, I think it's the easiest thing a parent who wants to form their children, just organize your year and any spiritual practices around the rhythms of Christian timekeeping. And this might mean that you have to learn about these rhythms. This is part of why we teach them and try to model them in our church. But for me, one of the books that was super helpful is a guy named Robert Weber. This book's not new anymore at all, but he is somebody who went from not understanding the Christian conceptions of time. He's from the evangelical tradition, and he encountered the rhythms of Christian life, and he wrote a book called Ancient Future Time. This is a great place to start if you want to know a little bit more about, okay, so the Christian calendar starts with the feasts and the observances of Advent, going up to Christmas, ends with the Feast of Pentecost and beginning an ordinary time in the spring. There's so many tools available for this. Again, we'll try to offer those in some of our bibliography at the end. But what I wanted to offer to you, this is something that we have tried in our family, is to see forming our children as less a practice of giving them information. So I think some of us think of formation, spiritual formation, as teaching our kids, like using the metaphor of a classroom, where faith is exclusively about knowing and learning and ideas and memorizing, right? Which are all important things, but that's not the full scope of spiritual formation. And I actually ran across this idea in the work of Aaron Nyquist. I'll throw his book in the bibliography as well. He talks about spiritual formation. We should use the metaphor of a gymnasium, where faith is more about practice, and it's informed by senses and bodies and repetition. So it's not memorization, but like repetition. So doing the same things over. And the Christian calendar helps with this. So I'll just sort of highlight a couple ways. in our family, the practices of Advent, obviously you can get calendars and work your way towards Christmas. That's an easy thing to do with children of all ages. One of the other ones that we have found is super helpful is in the season of Lent, moving towards Easter. There are a number of reading resources that you can center. We light candles and sort of observing the move towards Easter, the longing for light. And I mean, I could provide lots of things, but I think why would we do this? Well, Christian timekeeping is all about feasting and fasting, or pulling back from the world. It's leaning into it and experiencing its joy, and then also leaning back from the parts of it that might be heavy and hard. And I think we don't have to do this work alone, that the tradition sort of has it baked into it, and if we are willing to learn from the tradition, we can sort of figure out ways to incorporate it into the natural rhythms of our family. In our family, it's in Lent, one of the ways we sort of do a family media fast as a way of engaging some of the rhythms of that particular season, but then also just choosing, it's become a really interesting way of practicing faith as, okay, this is something I need to pay attention to, and I need to repeat to myself the practice of evaluating my relationship with media and also my relationship to the broader world and the longing that it holds for a renewal that Easter sort of symbolizes. So I'm going to just keep going. Just a few, I'm going to do two more here. I sort of had this item, the practice of extracurricular faith. What this means is, this is just rooted in some data that emerged from a study that was done by just over 2,000 young adults a number of years ago, where two key factors were shown to be, well, they were key factors for continuing religious engagement or involvement for young adults. And one of them was basically seeing adults, often parents, practice spiritual action, like outside of liturgy. And so there's an invitation for us as parents. If you don't have any spiritual practices that are public or that your children might be aware of, this is something to think about. Is this, maybe I felt an invitation to practice a particular spiritual discipline. I would say that this is a really lovely way to sort of inform your children. The other factor is what we sort of refer to as religious experiences that are outside of everyday life. And summer camps is the one that popped up for lots of people. And one of the things that I want to just sort of touch on there is that there's an invitation to experience our faith in an expanded community. And what can be tricky is that lots of summer camps can not always be built on the kinds of theology that some of us are okay with. Some of us might have religious trauma from being in summer camps. And one of the things that I think is great is that there are some organizations that we are sort of around or familiar with here in Calgary that I think we could say, maybe we wouldn't agree with all of the theology. That's probably almost every Christian organization. But we think that this is probably a safe environment for our children to experience the Christian tradition outside of the normal everyday life and also have a whole lot of fun and shenanigans in the process. So for me, what was lovely is to see that reflected in the data, that the experience of faith lived out in a wider community is really important for some children's development and then choosing to be involved in the tradition later on.
That makes a lot of sense.
Does it?
Yeah.
Oh man, I think we're over an hour. I talked about the recovery of spiritual practice, how we can experience this. What I want to do, I think I want to just say that I have a number of resources that I can point you to. I have some books up here. I'll throw them on the course list as resources to encourage you to consider. For me, this is the big piece around formation, is to think more about postures that we can take in the developmental stages of our children's lives. So when they're young, I might narrate and dictate a lot more. When they are in their sort of middle years, so think age 7 to 12, I will do a lot of coaching, right? I'll be the facilitator in family practice. There will be some play involved, and then also the active engagement that I choose to as a parent. I'm going to choose to try to build strong bonds with a Christian community, especially in that window of 7, because that's where developmentally we form strong social attachments and a sense of cohesion in broader groups beyond the family. And what's interesting in a society that doesn't prioritize religion in the same way. We see social sort of groups forming around things like sports or things around hobbies or music or performance, and we invest in those things as parents. And if those are to the exclusion of spiritual formation or choosing to be involved in a faith community, then we just need to realize that we are forming our children spiritually through omission, which we will probably do at some point anyways. It's not that that's harmful in all cases. It's just to be aware of it. And then the posture that we take as they sort of become teenagers and young adults is one of curiosity and support. And as Meg, you mentioned, learning with our children. So I think I have older children that are teenagers, and the kinds of questions they have about the world and they have about God, they actually stretch me. If I'll let them. They can teach me something about what it means to live in the world. And I think one of the things that we see in current generations, I think Gen Z is actually one of the places we see it in the data. So these are children born from 1995 to 2010. Those are when my kids are born, but there are some of you, your parenting children that are even younger than that. Gen Z is where we started to see issues of climate change, inequality, social unrest, political and racial divisions, economic distress, have effectively impacted and now shaped an entire generation of people to be wired to be engaged and politically active. And this is why one of my points for spiritual formation, just having a justice orientation isn't an option in our parenting. So to just know that our children will likely care about issues that we don't care as much about, and we're going to need to choose to be learners with them. All right, I think I'm going to wrap up. I want to just sort of turn to Chris's question here before we go. Oh, what a lovely question, Chris. I'm just going to read it aloud for those who may not have access to the stream at a later time. Having grown up in a particular tradition, let me read it. Yeah, how do other traditions help answer big questions? Are there family-friendly resources that we can look into? I did not read this question ahead of time. One of my points, you may have seen it pop up on the screen, is that I think actually one of the ways that we can form our children is by teaching or being open to forming them as religiously literate people. And this is especially for older kids. Most of your kids are going to go to school. They're going to be in Canada's educational institutions, and they're going to be taught about other religious traditions, the basic understanding of the texts, the feasts, the celebration, the contemporary forms. And this means that you're going to get to do your own learning. But specifically, Chris, to your question, I can't think of a family-friendly resource right now to do some of that work in forming, but I will see if I can come up with one to offer. But one of the reasons why I think being open to religious literacy and trying to foster it in our kids is because at its core, religious literacy is about the love of neighbor, and attempting to offer Christ-like welcome to those who are different than us. And that, to me, seems like a fundamental value. It's a fundamental value for me. If I'm going to carry this tradition, if I'm going to offer that kind of literacy to others, what is interesting, Christianity being the dominant tradition in this culture, to look out and see other traditions teaching me something about what it means to welcome and to be more open, and give me an opportunity to learn how to be even more like my tradition challenges me to be. So I will try to offer some more. I don't know if you have anything. Do you have any family resources, specifically in awareness with other traditions?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay.
But I had a very similar thing on the list that I didn't mention, but that part of helping them develop their spiritual formation is to expose them to the variety of ways that people think about God and faith in the world. And I don't, Chris, sorry, have a resource for that either. But if you look, I look, we'll find you something.
Yeah, I will certainly. And I think this is actually, it's part of how we can just by your question implies the kind of openness that I think is what we want. I think we should try to form our children this way.
Agreed.
To be open, and And well, also, what's interesting is that this informs spiritual practice in our own lives and in our children's lives through parallelism, as in, if you're aware of what others think and believe and hope about the world, this helps sharpen your own understanding of your own perspective, and some curiosity. And so that openness can also be sort of there's a reciprocity in it. It can form a greater love for a tradition. Do you have anything you want to add here before? I mean, we have kept people over an hour.
Yes,
so.
And they probably want to go find out who's going to win the hockey game.
Yes, there is a hockey game happening while we're filming this. So
maybe you don't care, but we're Oilers fans in my house. So no, I think that is actually a kind of a logical place to stop in terms of kind of puts a little bow on all the things that we talked about. I think ultimately that piece you mentioned about curiosity and wonder, that if we can instill a sense of curiosity and wonder around our faith and around our children's faith, that's something they're going to want to be engaged in. Yeah. Yeah,
I hope that's true. I hope that's true. And we offer this conversation as we have all of them, knowing that you are shaping the lives of your children and you're doing so with great care. With great sensitivity. Imperfectly, we all do it that way. Yep. There's no other way. But I think, and I hope that your participation and your choice to try to be aware and to do some of this work on your own, it is going to shape a spacious, humble faith in, or I hope it will, in the children that sort of maybe someday will watch us talk about these things and think about them with us. So. We are going to end our sort of parenting course with that sort of encouragement to keep doing this work. You aren't alone in doing it, and I actually love that we're creating this is like a first step in a resource that we can offer not only to our community but to others, and there will be other resources to come. Before we sign off, I want to offer some quick thank yous. First of all, I want to thank all of you as participants, whether you're listening live or whether you're listening someday in the future, for the ways in which you've leaned in to the conversation. You've offered your thoughtfulness here in this space, and you've offered your feedback along the way, and we will reach out hoping to get a little bit more of that in the coming days. I want to thank all the experts. Meg is just the last who came. We had Trina and Jen as well, who came and offered your expertise, your clinical awareness. You also brought some of your personal stories to bear, and that has been a great gift to us. Check out these practitioners and their practices. They're referenced in the sessions themselves. If you are looking for some more professional consultation or some help in the area of parenting or the area of being healthy and whole, right?
Absolutely. I think I mentioned therapy several times last week. I'll put a little plug in there too. It doesn't have to be my practice, but any kind of therapy can be very helpful. So I will always, my bias is showing, but I will always encourage that. Yeah. There's always room for growth.
So. Always room for growth. All right. Thank you to Kevin Borst and to Landon Buckley for all of their tech help in pulling this course together and offering it to you. Parenting in real life is a challenge. Here we are trying to do it, but we aren't alone in doing it. So thanks for joining us tonight. Awesome. We'll see you soon.